Hello all of you wonderful people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com, and I don't know about you, but 2019 really dropped the ball when it came to the WWE 2K game, right? Now I know that some of you out there might enjoy it, you know what, more power to you, but over on the gaming channel, plug, we spoke at length as to what went wrong, how it was mishandled, and basically how we shouldn't allow this sort of thing to happen again. Yet today, I'm not going to be talking about the current state of wrestling games and instead travel back in time to what can only be described as the ECW of electronic wrestling games, these sort of underdogs, the forgotten, and really are stuff that only the hardcore fans will remember. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 wrestling games only true fans will remember. And yes, before you snarky comment hounds point out, you could easily call this list 8 wrestling games only older fans remember, but you know what? Take it with a bit of salt. Number 8, Rock and Wrestle. 1985's Rock and Wrestle by Australia's Melbourne House has the distinction of being the first wrestling video game ever released for personal home computers. Known as Bop and Wrestle in the US, this 8-bit brawl fest was notable for featuring sampled sound effects including a referee's 3 count and a ringing bell. And just to be clear, the inclusion of sampled audio in home computer games at the time was fairly rare. In singles mode, gamers would be able to play as the stereotypical muscle-bound wrestler known as Gorgeous Greg. Greg would compete against a rogue galleries of 1980s wrestling archetypes, including a punk rocker, a masked luchador, and what I imagine most of Phil's relatives look like, aka a hillbilly. As a product of its time, each wrestler had an identical moveset, with only their head sprite and attire color serving as distinguishing physical attributes. In 2-player mode, gamers were allowed to choose which wrestler they wanted to, but for all intents and purposes, this didn't really mean much in terms of stats and things like that. Despite breaking new ground, this game was not actually well received upon its release. The controls were understandably limited, and the wonky ring view during gameplay coupled with the wrestler's inability to move diagonally has prevented the game from aging well. That being said, this piece of wrestling video game history from down under is definitely still worth exploring for vintage video game enthusiasts and professional wrestling historians. Number 7, Championship Wrestling. Championship Wrestling was originally released by Epix Games in 1986. A few years earlier, Epix had found success in creating licensed Barbie and Hot Wheels games for Mattel. Epix was hoping to make a similar agreement with the WWF, though for unknown reasons this deal never went through. Perhaps if Mattel had a business relationship with the then WWF like they do with the present-day WWE, the deal might have materialized. Unfortunately for Epix, they would have had to settle for a roster of generics and knockoffs instead. Players would select one of 8 WWF stars, including Hulk Hogan and Ultimate Warrior lookalikes, to compete in a championship tournament. Boasting a then impressive library of 25 different moves, this arcade-style outing was well received by trade publications. Though the monotonous gameplay would probably bore modern gamers to sleep faster than the Great Khali main event today, in 1986 Championship Wrestling proved that wrestling games for the home computer were a viable enterprise after all. Number 6, MicroLeague Wrestling. Wrestling has come a long way since the steroid-fueled cartoonish days of the 1980s, in that now we have only half the roster getting done for wellness policy violations, and we have a literal children's TV host as the, at the time of recording, Universal Champion. I do kid, of course, but it's a bit weird how it's still kind of the same. But in terms of wrestling games though, it has changed a great deal. For proof, one must look no further than 1987. With the advent of the rock and wrestling connection earlier in the decade, wrestling had become more mainstream than ever before. WWF megastars like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage were now dominating TV screens and magazine covers across the world. It was only natural that the WWF was looking to emulate this success through other forms of media, and so they firmly planted their collective size 13 boots into the technological realm with MicroLeague Wrestling. Released for various home computer systems in 1987, MicroLeague Wrestling was the very first WWF video game in any capacity, and it was okay. I mean, the stars were definitely all here, but were they aligned with the action? No, not in the slightest. In fact, MicroLeague was a turn-based strategy offering. A number of preset matches, including Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan vs. Paul Orndorff, were available for players to select from. On their turn, players would select a move or action for their character. If the selection was successful, a digitized image of their character performing the move would appear on screen. So if you ever wanted to mix the likes of Final Fantasy with wrestling, then this is the game for you. Come to think of it, that is actually something I would love to happen. That crossover needs to happen. Number 5, Sergeant Slaughter's Mat Wars. In the 1980s, Sergeant Slaughter was a household name. The Sarge rose to prominence as a patriotic babyface towards the end of the Cold War era and during the professional wrestling boom of the 1980s. He became a hot commodity. The popular toy line and animated series G.I. Joe licensed Sergeant Slaughter's likeness, creating one of their most successful action figures in the process. Sarge would go on to voice himself in the animated G.I. Joe features and even worked as the spokesperson for G.I. Joe until his WWF heel run as an anti-American Iraqi sympathizer in the early 1990s. During the height of Sergeant Slaughter's popularity, Mindscape Inc. released the now obscure Sergeant Slaughter's Mat Wars for the Commodore 64. In this 1989 game, players start out as a manager attempting to forge a stable of dedicated workers. Once a wrestler is in your roster, you can play as them in matches. The goal is to help your entry-level wrestlers evolve from barn-based brawls to big arena championship matches, all the while trying to maintain stable finances as a manager. There are no recognizable playable characters in the game, though Slaughter does appear as a referee and occasional in-game narrative device. The game is plagued with limitations of its time, though, making it largely forgettable. Despite this, the combination of its unique gameplay coupled with Slaughter's likeness made this an interesting look back at 1980s wrestling media. Number 4. American Tag Team Wrestling. British publisher Zeppelin Games released American Tag Team Wrestling in 1992. As the name suggests, this game only features tag team action. Like many wrestling video games of the era, it follows a basic elimination storyline. You select a tag team and attempt to win a tournament, and that's about it. It's kind of like Ring of Honor storytelling, basic and focused on the action. Oddly though, matches contained timed rounds similar to boxing. When a wrestler was weakened, he or she would retreat to the corner and tag to their opponent. The gameplay primarily features your standard strikes and limited grapples comparable to any other wrestling games from the time, though it was one of the first computer games to allow top rope maneuvers. Contemporary reviews of the game were generally favorable, though the game was criticized for not featuring any music and for all of the sprites looking too similar. All in all, American Tag Team Wrestling is as forgettable as kind of like your run-of-the-mill modern-day WWE Tag Team Championship run, which is just sad when you say it aloud. Thank God for the New Day, though. Number 3. WWF European Rampage Tour. In 1991, WWF released its second PC game, WWF WrestleMania. This game was an international success, due in part to the fact that this was the very first WWF release available on a variety of computer systems that were dominating the European market at the time. 1 year later, the company decided to recapitalize on this emerging European market by launching WWF European Rampage Tour. In most versions of the game, players select 2 WWF wrestlers to form a tag team. They then compete in a series of matches set in London, Munich and Paris against the Nasty Boys, Money Incorporated and the Natural Disasters. If a player wins each of these matches, they will then face the Legion of Doom in New York at Madison Square Garden. In the Commodore 64 version, players compete in a series of singles matches instead of tag team action. Streets ahead of 1987's MICROLEAGUE Wrestling, this European release actually offers a gaming experience that is still enjoyable today. Plus, who doesn't love having a tussle in old Blighty? Lord knows we're tired of fighting ourselves at the moment. Number 2. WWF With Authority. With Authority, made by Genetic Anomalies and THQ, was one of the first online trading card games ever released. From 2001 to 2003, With Authority allowed players to purchase digital booster packs containing cards featuring abilities and moves to be employed during gameplay. Cards would have various degrees of rarity and effectiveness, just like traditional card collecting games. As a multiplayer-only game, players were able to compete against online fans from all over the world. Now, in 2001, this was a big deal, and at its height, there were over 1,000 players playing the game at any given time. Again, it doesn't sound like much today, but back in the day, God, that was crazy! With an in-game ranking system of every player, competitors would strive to keep their win-loss record in the positive, and if they did, they could go to official events and win championships. Honestly, it was mad. Players would compete in official in-game World Heavyweight Championship, Intercontinental Championship, European Championship, and Hardcore Championship, and if you won, you would have to defend your title on a regular basis, making you feel as part as anyone else of the house that Body Oil built. And number 1, Extreme Warfare Revenge. To some degree, every wrestling fan is a fantasy booker. Lord knows the amount of time that people stop me on the street and tell me how they would have booked The Undertaker's last match or how they would sort out the WWE, like I've got any creative sway with them. My friends, we are this close to being blacklisted by Vince for blasting him on the regular. I know you can't see my fingers, but they are very close. Still though, now you have the chance to enact a true football Manager Crossbody Edition with Extreme Warfare Revenge. In the mid-1990s, programmer Adam Rylan began developing a series of free wrestling management simulators to satisfy fans' desire to control their own wrestling organization, and in 1995, Rylan developed Extreme Warfare. This simulator allowed players to control match outcomes and simple financial functions like wrestlers' wages. From there, he began developing more complex games with the release of Extreme Warfare Deluxe and finally Extreme Warfare Revenge in 2002. Now, Extreme Warfare Revenge developed a large cult following due to its in-depth features and high levels of customization. In EWR, you could operate a promotion as small as a backyard federation or as large as an international organization. You'd book feuds and matches while attempting to maintain the overness rating of your roster, your public image, and the financial status of your company. Not only do you oversee a roster of wrestlers, you also have to manage staff including referees, announcers, agents, writers, and even development territory trainers. The customization options allow users to edit most of the game's information as well, meaning that you can keep the roster as up to date as you'd like. It's still receiving updates, and I actively encourage you to check this out, and also the upcoming Total Extreme Wrestling, which is set to drop next year. I'm very excited. And there we go, my friends. Those were 8 wrestling video games that only true fans will remember. I hope that you enjoyed that, and please sound off if you've played any of these down below and what you thought about them. Shout out to my old boys out there. In fact, massive shout out to all of you. I know that this video is probably coming out in the early 2020 when January is cold and dark and things possibly might be looking a little bit ominous for a few as we're unsure of how the year's gonna unfurl. But I just want to say it is okay to take a break. I cannot stress this enough. Even though it's the start of the year and everyone's going to be telling you that they're doing tons and tons of stuff and setting goals and trying to achieve things, don't let that put pressure on yourself if you need to take a step back and actually analyze your own situation. Don't just throw a ton of energy into something that you can't control the outcome of. Take a step back, talk to your friends and family if you are struggling, or professionals in the support industry, and realize where best your energy is spent, because you might realize that things are a ton easier when you're able to share that problem. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me at RetroJ with a 0 over on Twitter. As always, you have been awesome. Never forget that, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.